Hi, I'm Stephanie Hertz, Marketing Director here at Workforest. Today I'm talking to you from one of our stage units here at Workforest. It is our 2-bedroom, 2-bath cottage where we have availability right now. So if you are thinking about moving to a cottage at Workforest, I'd love to talk to you further about this option. Today I'm introducing Liz Moore, who will be speaking to you about the 5 most important trends in local real estate. A 30-year veteran in the industry, Liz Moore opened her real estate brokerage in Newport News in 2003. The company has grown considerably over the past 18 years and now has over 150 agents in offices in Williamsburg, Richmond, and the Northern Neck, as well as on the peninsula. Liz has been recognized as Entrepreneur of the Year by the Virginia Peninsula Chamber of Commerce, as well as honored with Women in Business Achievement Award by Inside Business of Hampton Roads and Small Business Person of the Year by the Greater Williamsburg Chamber of Commerce. She has served on the Peninsula's advisory board for Children's Hospital of the King's Daughters and has spearheaded fundraising efforts for the hospital that have raised over $140,000. Liz and her husband Roger have lived in Williamsburg since 1995. They have one son, Grayson, who graduated from CMU and is now working as a realtor for Liz Moore & Associates. Here is Liz, again talking to you today about the 5 most important trends in local real estate.
I am honored to be invited to speak to this group, and I'm a little disappointed that we're doing it on Zoom and not in person, but I am going to do my best to keep this as an interactive conversation. So please feel free to put questions in the chat box. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on that, and Mackenzie has promised to help me. So if you have questions, we'll try and catch those as we go along and pick up at the end anything that we may have missed. So today we're going to talk about the most important trends in local real estate. Let me start by telling you a little bit about my journey. I've been around the block a few times. So talking about trends, a lot of the things that we're seeing right now are things that I have definitely experienced before. And one of the things that we're going to talk about today is how the current market compares to things that we've seen, for instance, in the 2008 to 2012 cycle, which I know is really what everybody's worried about. So I've been licensed since 1984. When I started in the business, interest rates were hovering right about 14%, and sellers were paying 3 discount points in order to sell their houses back then. So some of you all will remember that. It was definitely a very interesting time in real estate, and things are actually much better in 2021 than they were back then. So let's jump right into it. I think what most people are most interested in is, what does the pandemic mean for local real estate? Is this another housing bubble? Obviously, that's a concern. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. And in that, we're also going to talk about what the major trends are. Inventory is a big one. So we're definitely going to cover that. We're going to talk about the impact that interest rates are having on the current market. We're going to talk about sales demand. And I think that you'll be interested to see what has gone on despite the fact that we've been in the middle of a pandemic. We're going to talk about pricing strategies in a seller's market, because we are very definitely in a seller's market. So I'm curious, from your perspective, do you all feel like we're experiencing a down market as a result of the pandemic? Are you concerned that we're headed for another housing bubble? Put that in chat. I would just be curious to see How many of you all think that a housing bubble is the direction that we're going? Okay, I see some yeses. See if I can minimize that a little bit. Yep. Okay, I see a couple of yeses. Well, let's jump right into it. I do think everybody is concerned about it being a bubble. Having lived through 2008 into 2012, I'm going to tell you that my opinion is we are definitely not in a housing bubble. Mackenzie, if you could advance the slide for me. Okay, actually, let me go back and talk about one thing before we get there. Nope, advance the slide. That's good. Mackenzie and I are a two-man show here today. So let's talk about what local means. And I say that because the statistics that I'm going to talk about today are based on our local market. And when I say local, I'm pulling that from Newport News, Hampton, York County, Poquoson, James City County, and Williamsburg. So really what most locals would refer to as the peninsula and Williamsburg. Our neighboring markets, which are Gloucester and Smithfield, are going to be pretty similar to what we're talking about today. But everybody should realize that specific neighborhoods, specific price points could definitely be different, especially as we get into the luxury markets. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But all of the data that I'm sharing with you today is based on that peninsula and Williamsburg demographic, basically. Okay, several of you have asked in chat, what is a bubble? So let's start with that. What happened back in the 2004, 2005, 2006 timeframe across the country, but especially locally, is we got into a total frenzy in the housing market. And prices went crazy, they escalated. Mortgage companies were offering mortgages for just about anybody who could fog a mirror could get a mortgage. People were using their houses like ATMs and pulling out all of the equity in loans. So they had very little equity in their houses. And then when the market hit a wall, the housing bubble burst, and we went from all of this frenzied purchasing to a market where people really could not even, they were really struggling to sell their homes. It was a very, very difficult time. And because there has been such frenzied buying for the last 18 months, there's a lot of discussion that we are headed for a housing bubble again. I would like to put your mind at ease about that a little bit. I think not only are we not heading for a housing bubble, but I think it's almost the opposite of that. So if you would advance for me, Mackenzie. There's a couple of reasons for that. Housing supply is at a historic low. Demand is real, and we're going to talk about that. And even if there were to be a drop in housing prices, there's enough equity out there that homeowners are going to be fine. We wouldn't see the kind of foreclosures that we saw back 2008 to 2012. So let's dive in specifically to why. I think that the inventory is a huge issue. And so one of the things that is a benchmark that we use to measure what's going on in the market is what we call months supply of inventory. And what months supply of inventory means is if we took all of the listings that are actively available today and divided it by the average number of houses that are going under contract each month, then that gives you the month's supply of inventory. So in other words, how many months would it take for the market to absorb the active inventory that's out there? Back in 2006 to 2008, month supply of inventory went from 5 months in 2008 to over 11 months of inventory in 2006 to 2008. 11 months of inventory is a lot of inventory. And in our luxury markets locally, so for instance, Ford's Colony, Governor's Land, and Williamsburg, price points over, at that time, $500,000. In some cases, we had 2 years of inventory out there, which is just crazy. A balanced market, which means there's kind of an even number of buyers and sellers in the market, is somewhere between 5 and 6 months of inventory. Well, month supply of inventory has been under 5 months for 3 years. And right now, we are measuring it in terms of weeks instead of years. So that is a huge difference between the 2008 market and the 2021 market. In 2008, people couldn't sell their houses because there was so much inventory. Now buyers are anxiously waiting for more inventory. So next slide, please, Mackenzie. So this is going to give you a look at things locally. And if you can't read the numbers on the chart, that really doesn't matter, because specifically what I want you to get from this slide is just the general idea of what month supply of inventory looks like on the peninsula and in Williamsburg. So as you can see, this chart is looking back 2 years. So the left side of the chart is showing you what inventory looked like in late 2019. So this was pre-pandemic. The market had really been hovering right around a little bit less than 4 months of inventory, which is definitely favoring sellers, but it's not a strong seller's market. 4 months of inventory is really a pretty balanced market. And then you'll see what happened as the pandemic was announced and people started to realize what was happening. We really hit a drop off in inventory. And I think you don't see the big change until June of 2020, but that's because a lot of people already had their houses on the market. They were in the process of, they'd already purchased a new house and were moving. So we had to cycle through some of that inventory, but we definitely saw a drop off in terms of people who were putting their houses on the market. Now, what you'll notice is that we're measuring inventory in terms of weeks. So depending on which neighborhood or price point you're in, our month supply of inventory is literally hovering around a half. So that is one big difference between 2008 time period and what we're seeing now. Next slide, we'll talk about housing demand. In 2008, back when we were experiencing the economics of that time period, things were really just crazy. Some of you probably follow the Case-Shiller Index, which is a local index of housing trends and statistics. Robert Shiller called that market irrational exuberance. Everybody was just crazy thinking that house prices were going to continue to go up and up and up and up, paying crazy amounts for houses, paying over asking prices. The mortgage companies were really not regulating that. As I mentioned earlier, if you could fog a mirror, you could get a mortgage. And in that situation, it really was creating a dangerous situation, a precarious situation for a lot of those home buyers. It's very, very different now. In the current market, part of what's fueling it is we're seeing the millennials, which is the largest generation in the country right now, have hit that age bracket where they're marrying, they're having families. And so those are two of the biggest drivers for home ownership. A second thing that's happened that I think has kind of been the perfect storm with the pandemic is the health crisis has really had us evaluate home and what that means. So people are finding that they can work remotely now, which means they could choose to live in Yorktown or Williamsburg or Newport News rather than working in a big city. And we're seeing a lot of housing migration come from the big cities down to our smaller towns. We've definitely benefited from that. Then, of course, you look at the interest rates and what impact that has. So I think this next slide is fascinating. You can see what interest rates were in the 1970s and 1980s and what that meant for a typical house payment for someone who was buying a house back then. So a $300,000 house in the 1980s, now granted, a $300,000 house in the 1980s was a really, really, really nice house, but the house payment for that was $3,250. Today, the exact same house payment is $1,250. So that is a significant difference that is definitely compelling buyers to ignore the pandemic. I mean, we saw buyers still fighting for houses when the pandemic was in its infancy. And I really think that interest rates are a huge driver of that. Next slide is going to show you, if you'll advance it one more time, Mackenzie, great. This is going to show you what those interest rates have looked like. Since 1975, and many of you all will remember the late 70s and early 80s and what they looked like then. The reason that this is important is because I think interest rates are going to be one of the most important drivers of the future market. At some point, in order for the economy to correct, interest rates have got to increase. And so anyone out there who is thinking about buying needs to take that into consideration, because you just saw the impact that that has on your payment. Now, of course, there's some really interesting things going on at the federal level in terms of our economy. And I think there are some arguments that the Fed would be in a tough place to raise interest rates because of the debt service that the country's carrying right now. They can't really afford to see interest rates go up a whole lot. So that puts them in an interesting predicament. But keeping an eye on these rates from a home buyer standpoint is definitely going to be one of the things that drives the market. So on the next slide, you'll be able to see demand over the last 2 years. So what the blue bars are representing is the number of under contracts in our market that we have seen since August of 2019. So a couple of things to note here. You'll see sort of the curve, and that's a natural curve that's seasonal. So the year really starts in January and things begin to tick up into the spring market through the summer, and then they fall off over the holidays and through the winter months, and then the cycle starts again. But you can see clearly where the median line is here. And although we saw a dip here in under contracts and a dip here, a slight dip here, this was March to April in 2020, right after the pandemic was announced. It bounced up to record numbers by June, by the summer. So there was a lot of discussion about how long would the recovery take. The economic recovery has obviously been another story, but the housing market bounced back almost immediately, higher than ever. You see that our December, January, February trough here, how much higher it was than previous years, and where we are now going into the winter months. it has been record month after record month after record month. So if you take a look back over the last 2-year period, sales are up 77%, which that is absolutely a phenomenal number, taking all of that into account. Then the next statistic that I think is interesting is household equity. Again, during the housing boom, and I'm talking now about 2004, 2005, 2006, when that was going on, it wasn't just new homeowners. It was people saying, I need to refinance and I'm going to take cash out of my house. That left people borrowing against inflated values. So once the values started coming down, there were a lot of Americans who were actually what we call upside down, which means they owed more on their properties than their properties were worth. And so as the market crashed, we started to see a whole series of foreclosures because people were in a position that they couldn't sell their properties. The good news today is, and Mackenzie, if you'll pull up the next slide, here you can see what the equity position of most of America is in today compared to what it looked like back then when we had so many Americans that were underwater. Mackenzie, would you pull up the next slide for me? Thank you. So this is showing that almost 54% of Americans have got at least 50% equity in their houses. 37% of Americans own their homes free and clear. So these are people that definitely learned their lesson during the last housing bubble and have been much more conscious about paying down on their mortgages, making sure they're in a solid equity position, saving for retirement. 26% or 27% of the mortgaged homes have at least 50% equity. And the reason that this is important, if you're asking the question, are we headed toward another housing bubble, is even for those folks who have been impacted economically by the pandemic. So we know we have a lot of people who are out of work. In addition to some of the stimulus packages that were available by the government, in addition to that, even if people were pressed to have to sell because they could no longer afford their house, they have so much equity and the market is so strong that those sellers are going to be able to sell their houses in a normal market situation without ever having to go and face a foreclosure situation. So that's really a great thing. Even when things were at their dire worst in terms of joblessness, owners were not in a situation where they were really facing foreclosures. I think our foreclosure rate is actually lower than it has been in a very, very long time. So that's good news. The next slide is the number that everybody is really usually the most interested in, which is, okay, what's my house worth? So everybody knows that if we have high demand and low supply, that is going to push up values. And you'll see that that is exactly what has happened. So this is looking at our local market over the last 2 years. And what you see is that median price line. We've been over the median price line ever since the early part of this year. We're showing a 21% appreciation over the last 2 years. So if you cut that number in half, it's over 10% a year, which is a healthy, healthy price appreciation. So you might ask, okay, should that scare me? Is that the same kind of inflationary pricing that we saw back in 2008? My answer to that is no, because it has really taken us this long to catch up with where values had been if the market had not crashed back in 2008, if that makes sense. So I think there are definitely still some room for the positive trends to continue. And when we're in a market that has low inventory and high demand, sellers are obviously sitting in the catbird seat and able to push the envelope a little bit on what they can ask for their house. The other thing that happens in a seller's market like this is sellers are not having to make the same kind of concessions and adjustments, negotiating the way that they would have to in a buyer's market. So if you have thought about selling, this is a good time to do it in terms of maximizing the amount of money that you'll get out of your house and minimizing the amount of work that you'll have to put into a house in order to sell it. Any questions about those stats that we have talked about so far? Median price, inventory. Any questions about that so far? Okay, the next chart that I want to show you is an internal report that we put together for our agents. And I run this report every single month. And essentially what it is, I know it looks like a lot of data, but it is showing by price band how many offers in a market exceed the asking price. So if you put your house on the market and you're asking $300,000 for it, what can you expect to get? According to our August numbers, 56% of the offers in that situation are going to be above your asking price. So that generally means we've got some kind of a bidding war going on. Now, not everybody is that the case for. 13% are under asking price and 30% are at asking price. But what we've got our eye on as real estate agents is the overall trend here. And so if you look at the total, 45% of all closings in August happened above asking price. Well, that number was 65% in January. And so we've watched it steadily come down month after month, with, not to say it's not still a strong market, but there's fewer buyers who are willing to get involved in a bidding war. A number of buyers have just said, you know what, I'm going to back out of the market a little bit. I'm going to wait until it cools down and then we'll try it again. So there's no question that although it is a strong market, the market is definitely beginning to cool a little bit. And my advice to buyers in that situation is you want to be careful with that, because if you wait until interest rates go up, as we saw from the slide in the middle of the presentation, your actual cost is going to be higher with a higher interest rate, even with a lower sales price. So there's just a lot of different moving parts in the market right now. So depending on what you're thinking about, there's a lot of things to consider. But if you are thinking about selling your house, I think you will find that this is probably the strongest market that we have been in since, I would say, 2005 for selling. And I joke a lot at my office. My husband and I talked about back in 2004, 2005, we should have sold our house. We should have sold our house. But of course, you don't know when the peak is until it's passed. And that is always the case. But if you were asking me for my forecast and my prediction for what the market's going to look like in 2022, I think we're going to continue to have a strong seller's market. I think we will continue to see interest rates tick up just a little bit. I don't think that there will be any crazy spikes in interest rates next year, but I do think that the housing market is going to continue to be one of the bright spots in the economy, and that it is definitely going to help for the overall economy. So those are the stats that I wanted to talk about. I would love to entertain anybody's questions specifically. If you've got questions about any of the stats, if you've got questions about the market in general, trends that we're seeing in terms of housing, for a long time, and I'll chat about that just for a minute. For a long time, we were seeing a trend towards smaller houses, and people moving into the cities, wanting less land to take care of. They wanted a lower maintenance situation. Well, the pandemic has kind of flipped the switch on that a little bit, and we're starting to see people want to get out to more land and more space. And the trend is actually toward a little bit bigger houses. And the reason for that is because you're thinking about, you might have two people who are remotely working in the house. There might be kids who are studying virtually. So where in the past couple of years, we've been looking for open floor plans and smaller houses, now people are feeling that they need different private spaces in their house to accommodate remote working and virtual learning. So that's good news for any of you who potentially have bigger properties. And so that's one reason I think that we've seen those selling at a faster clip than they might have been in 2018 and 2019. Okay, hold on a second, because I'm missing some questions here. So Mackenzie's question, is this specific to the peninsula or is it similar on the south side? So the statistics that I used in the presentation are all Peninsula Williamsburg. However, the market that we're in is actually pretty consistent across the country. It's definitely the case on the south side. Our Richmond market is even tighter than our Peninsula market. So I think you're going to see the same trends everywhere. It just may not be quite as intense in some pockets of the market and some price points. And it's probably not going to be the case in places like New York City, where DC, where you've got people who are wanting to move out of the city and into a more rural community. So how much is no inspections or no contingencies? So that's a great question, Carl. When you're in a strong seller's market, the seller definitely has the leverage. And so what that means is if there are going to be multiple bidders coming in to make offers on a property, what those buyers have to do in order to win the bidding war is they've got to offer terms that are more attractive to that seller than the other buyers do. And price is one of those. And so obviously, as you saw from the over asking report, about half the time we're seeing buyers who are willing to pay even more than asking. But in addition to that, the terms and the contingencies are very, very important. And so we're also seeing buyers who are not necessarily waiving a home inspection, but who are agreeing up front to say, we're not going to ask for any repairs as a result of a home inspection. So we want to be able to preserve our right to cancel the contract if we find something we don't like, but we're not going to obligate you as the seller to repair things. That is very, very different than the market that we were in even 2 or 3 years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, sellers were having to make repairs almost in every situation as a result of a home inspection. The other thing that's always interesting to people, especially if you've been in your house a long time, is the whole update question. And if any of you all have heard me speak before, the gals at Patriots Colony and Warwick Forest kind of laugh at me about this. I've been doing this a long time. And so there was a time when in these kind of presentations, I told you, you had to upgrade to granite. You had to update your kitchen cabinets. You had to update your flooring in order to be able to be market ready and take advantage of what's in the market. In the current market climate, a lot of times you don't have to do any of that because the market is so strong, the buyers are willing to make those updates. As it relates to contingencies, that's a little bit more complicated because for most people, they have to sell the house they're in order to buy a new house. And so they're just not financially in a position to skip a contingency. But what you'll find as a seller is unless you're in a real peak price point, most buyers, or in most situations, there are buyers who have already sold their house and are ready to go. We're also seeing a fair number of cash offers in this market, more so in Williamsburg than on the peninsula, but I would say in Williamsburg, probably 25 to 30% of our offers are cash and the buyer's actually not getting a mortgage at all. Okay, I see a question on upcoming kitchen cabinet trends. Great question. So I was just talking about when I used to present, and this was probably, I don't know, 2015, 2016. I can remember telling everybody that white kitchens were out. And so if you had a white kitchen, the new wood tones were coming back in and you really needed to consider that. Well, guess what? If you wait long enough, every trend reverses and white kitchens are very much in right now. You're also seeing just painted cabinets with a little bit more color are definitely in. We've sort of moved through the gray phase. So for a while there, gray walls as opposed to beige walls were very, very popular. Now I'm recommending to go back to a more neutral beige, and even having some colors on the wall is okay as long as you're not too crazy about it. Buyers are definitely looking for a little bit more pizzazz than a completely vanilla color palette. So that's a great question. What color for bathroom tile and cabinets? Again, some colors are okay. Interestingly, the color, the background of my slide here is a very popular color right now. It's kind of a little bit blue, a little bit green in your bathrooms. That is definitely a popular color, a soothing color. Sea salt is a color that I recommend a lot. It's a little bit gray, a little bit green, a little bit blue, depending on the light. And in bathrooms, that can be a great color. Okay, Carl says, I'm talking about an offer. I'm not sure I understand, Carl, exactly what you're asking. If you're asking if you have to avoid any contingencies in your offer or any inspections in your offer, again, that's going to be case by case specific depending on if there's multiple offers in that price range. And that is definitely scaled by price point. So the lower the price point of the house, the more competitive it's going to be. As we start getting over $500,000, you've got fewer buyers in that price point, and definitely you're starting to see the sellers at least having a little bit of an ability to negotiate there. Is it worth it to paint the molding and chair molding if it's currently a wood tone? Also, fire blazes and red brick to white. Okay, this is a really good question. So, and I'm going to not talk so specifically about this, but just the whole updating question in general. So in this market, depending on, and this is going to be neighborhood specific and price point specific, but if there is very little inventory in the market that you're in, you can get away without doing that. However, and this is an important point, in most cases, you will still benefit financially from making the updates. So if you can create a situation that's turnkey for the buyer, what's going to happen is you'll have more buyers that are interested, and that's where you can take advantage of bidding wars and prices going up. If you don't want to update, so let's say the house I sold in York County when I moved to Williamsburg had all traditional stained trim. It was very, very popular in the 80s, and obviously it dated the house. So if that's your situation, I think for what the cost to paint it would be is going to be well worth it, because you're going to create a situation where you have more buyers who are willing to pay more for your house. If your house is too dated, then it really limits itself to prospective buyers who are either willing to do the work themselves or to investors. And a lot of buyers are just pretty picky. We're talking about millennials who are usually both people working and don't necessarily have the time for updates. So I would recommend that you talk to your realtor about that before you make the decision, because it is going to be neighborhood specific. What you don't want to do is spend money that you don't need to spend, but by the same token, oftentimes making those kind of improvements is going to pay off. So okay, can you explain what is the deal with signs I see on the road saying buy home for cash, full price offer, etc.? Yes. So because inventory is so low, there are a lot of investors in the market right now who are looking to just buy your house for cash. They'll buy it as is. They will do a quick close. And then what they do is they flip it. So we call this flipping. They'll come in, they'll put some money into it, usually only cosmetics. So the kind of things we were talking about in the last question: painting, trim, maybe replacing carpet, replacing countertops, painting a red brick fireplace to a white brick fireplace. I call it lipstick on a pig. So the flippers will come in, they'll do the cosmetic work, and then they'll resell the house for considerably more money. And if you think about that, that's really the same choice that you have as a homeowner, because you can make those same improvements and get more money. And although it may seem daunting, and I will tell you that working with contractors right now can be a little bit challenging. Getting contractors right now can be a little bit challenging. Your realtors have got relationships with contractors. And so it's a lot easier for us because we use them frequently and they depend on us for referrals. It's a lot easier for your realtor to be able to help you line up contractors who will do that kind of work, if that makes sense. Any other questions? And please feel free to call me if you have a specific question. My email address is up here, my cell phone address is up here, and I'm happy to answer any specific questions. Okay, here comes a few more. What is the price comparison to how much you get from these investor flippers or from a traditional agent? Great question. They are going to build in an agent's commission because they're probably going to list it when they resell it. They're also going to build in the money that they're going to put into it. So generally speaking, and this isn't 100% of the time the case, but generally speaking, you will do better to go the traditional route than to sell to an investor, because everybody is trying to save or make the same amount of money, if that makes sense. Usually the offers that they'll make you are somewhere in the 82 to 85% of the actual market value range. But the other thing to keep in mind with that is, depending on your neighborhood, we're in a low inventory market. And so market value may be $300,000, but you may be able to get over asking. So in that case, the disparity between what an investor would pay you is even more. Question, are white brick fireplaces better than red? No, not necessarily. That is definitely a matter of personal preference. I think that in some of the houses that were built in the 70s and 80s, we see a lot of red brick and we see a lot of stained trim, where those two things are very inexpensive updates. And although I wouldn't say a white brick fireplace is better, it definitely is going to give you a more updated look. And so that's going to be one of those enhancements that is probably worth the investment. Is there a preference currently for new homes or older homes? That is a great question. There is just demand for homes, period. And so because there is such a shortage of resale properties, it is driving people to new construction. The challenge in new construction over the past 18 months is because of the supply chain issues, getting framing, getting carpet, getting appliances, all of that has been so expensive that the cost of new homes has really shot up. And that is, in some cases, unaffordable to many buyers. So again, that's a specific question, but if I had to pick one, I would say resale homes are probably favored in this market primarily because of cost. Mackenzie, have I missed anything? I noticed today that a house on Maxwell Lane that was for sale by us for several weeks has no sign out saying it's sold. You know, that's a great question. And I don't personally know the answer to that without looking it up. My guess is it's probably under contract. Agents will sometimes choose not to advertise that a property is sold until they've moved through contingency periods and inspection periods, just to make sure that the deal is really solid before they take it off the market. Every situation is a little bit different in that regard. Yes, I appreciate all the questions. That makes this easy, and you guys ask great questions. So again, please feel free to reach out to me personally if you've got any questions or if there's anything I can do to help you.